Hi, I'm Larry Moss, creative director of Origami, as well as maintainer of BalloonHQ.com. I'm here to dive into balloon twister history today with Joseph Maar, Emmy award-winning executive producer director, one-time balloon entertainer, and the son of Hank Maar. Henry Maar was quite possibly the very first balloon twister. If he wasn't first, he was certainly responsible for launching the balloon entertainment business in much of the US back in the 1930s. We're going to explore the history of balloon twisting through Hank's career, his TV appearances, and even techniques employed by early balloon twisters that may have been forgotten today. This is the first of what will hopefully become a series of discussions about the history of balloon art. And now I want to ask Joseph to introduce himself a little and start this rolling.
Sure. Well, thanks so much. There's never been a time that I didn't know something about balloons or balloon twisting from when I was very little through this day. And by the age of 9, I actually had my own agent and was performing professionally with my dad. Before that, I was actually on shows with him as an assistant, whether it was television, vaudeville type shows, or club dates and company picnics. I think what's interesting is the conversation around what is the origin of balloon twisting. There are different accounts to reconcile, and in fact, I would recommend anybody who's interested a book written by Ralph Dewey, who's a bit of a historian, and did a ton of research on the origins of balloons, balloon animals, twisting, and all different types of things that might be of interest on the key beginning points. What probably never happened was to fully flesh out some of the things that were happening in America and how balloon twisting took hold. And so as a person who's worked in media most of my whole life, whether it was at ESPN or Fox, 10 years in California, you end up with a sense of what's going on in media, what's going on in entertainment, and how that relates to twisting. So what I was hoping to do is have a conversation, I guess, with you and the audience about sort of what's happening before the 1920s, and then balloon twisting and its origins as we sort of think of it in the 20s and 30s, Great Depression coming after the Roaring 20s, the war years of World War II, the explosion of TV in the 50s and 60s, what happens to twisting, really a big decline in the 70s, but sort of a transformation, because starting in the 80s, it's really when modern twisting is born. And I think we could talk a little bit then at the end maybe about the last 20 years, the internet, and where this art is going. So it'll be exciting. We do have some old film that shows you what it looked like 50 years ago or more. And so those clips will come up as well as some old TV shows. So with that, I'll let you start us off, Larry, with what you'd like to ask, what you think the most important questions would be.
Well, I think really where we need to start is how did balloons get into people's hands to even become a medium for creating art? With all of the tools we have around us and all of the forms of entertainment, something so young, it's kind of nice to be able to explore something that was really only 100 years ago, that there's an opportunity to dig down and find some of the people that were involved in it, to know where it came from. And I know one of the things that I had learned reading Dewey's book was Hank being, during a point of his youth when he was ill, had an opportunity to play with balloons. So I think that would be a fun and interesting direction to learn a little more
Sure.
about that, how that came to be.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. It's a piece of the history that Dewey touches on, but is pretty amazing because we now have had a pandemic. His book was written before it. We know what it's like to be in a pandemic, right? So you've got the Spanish flu in the 19 teens. My dad's born in 21. And people in the 20s, it's the Roaring 20s, they haven't forgotten about the Spanish flu. And if somebody comes down with a disease, in my dad's case it was pleurisy, some would have tuberculosis, often they would be sent to a sanitarium. Matter of fact, almost always they would be sent to a sanitarium, isolated from the rest of the world, not in the way that we have technology today. You were left there for years to either die or hopefully get better. And it was very common for the people who worked in the sanitariums to give patients balloons to blow to exercise their lungs. And that really was the beginning for my father in the late 1920s and then into the early 1930s, where he's got balloons that he's being told to blow on a regular basis to exercise his lungs. And so what does a kid do, right? When they're blowing balloons all day, they're not around their family. They're essentially almost like an orphan. And he starts to twist and make them into different shapes of toys and things, starting with
Well,
one that everybody
right,
sort of knows, which is the dog.
when you think about it, if and even unfortunately, a good friend of mine has a child currently in the hospital, and one of the things that I see when I look at kids in the hospital is that you present them with materials, they're bored, they're going to explore, they're going to, I mean, at home too, but you put them in that hospital situation, they're going to take the materials that they have and figure out what to do with them. So yeah,
Right.
that makes sense. And to your question of what was going on before this, you said, before we get into the 20s and the development of this, why didn't it happen sooner? Listening to you talk, and I don't remember what it was you said at the moment, it kind of triggered the thought of, well, it couldn't have happened sooner because balloons weren't made of rubber before that.
Right.
The earlier balloons, you weren't going to see doctors handing kids animal bladders and say, blow this up. So
Right.
that kind of even puts the, that really gives us the point that things got started, that it couldn't have been before that. I think,
Exactly, and the book even talks about that a little bit. That the thought is that Dewey sort of stakes a claim that my dad was the first twister as we would know it, but there was simultaneously another person out on the East Coast in I think Scranton maybe, who about the same time, quite a bit older gentleman, is kind of coming up with this idea of playing with balloons and turning them into something. In my dad's case, it was really more as this sort of toy that turned into an occupation. But you're totally right, and I think as we talk later, we may address other times that kids are in hospitals over the next 20 or 30 years where the balloon industry starts to move forward because of a notable person who is in a hospital. We've talked offline about Patch Adams, right? The movie Patch Adams. So there is sort of this connection that is happening with kids in hospitals. And that isn't just Hollywood. That's actually the real story of how it started at Muirdale Sanitarium in Milwaukee, where my dad was for many years, twisting these balloons that he had to keep blowing up into different shapes and eventually turning them into animals. Only one size at the time, which was a 336 size airship, if it wasn't just a round balloon. And so that's all he had to work with. So everything was done out of one size balloon.
now, if we could, I know this is jumping forward in time a little bit, but I think, we keep referring to playing with balloons, and what I think, let's give everybody a chance to see what we're talking about when we say playing with balloons. Would it be possible to jump into one of these videos for a minute? So it is going forward in
Sure.
time. Um,
Right.
I don't want
We
anybody
got some old
to
film from, sure, we got some old film from about 20 years ago, or from about 50 years ago, rather, that we can show, that is sort of Super 8 film that is literally just, my dad performing on a TV show in Chicago and, using literally the same size balloon to do everything. And,
So what
you
size is
know,
that?
this is a 336, and depending on what time this was, because I don't remember the exact year and company, but it was either Ashland Rubber or Pioneer Rubber. Dad would actually go to Ohio to get the balloons, sort of look at them. They were handmade. They were not manufactured in a typical process. That's actually me in the V-neck, the blue V-neck sweater at about, I don't know what age, 5 or something. So, that's really sort of an interesting clip as well, because it's kind of the beginning of the end. By this point, sort of the music industry, it's the 70s or late 60s, music is big, the Beatles, shopping malls are coming up. So the entertainment era is really changing. And in pop culture, TV's overtaking the music industry, right? LA is where most of the entertainment is based now. You've got all these shows, Laverne and Shirley, Happy Days, All in the Family, TV viewing hours, the Family Hour, that really sort of replaces the sort of vaudeville on TV kind of look that you've got at that point in the history of it. So, and I'll give you an example, if the camera can come back to me. This is a really great example of something that from our friends at Qualitex, but this is pretty close to about the same size, and it was very straightforward. This is, a balloon you could blow up, but what you could do at the time, you still can do today, is knowing what length to make something, you can twist and shorten it. Some of it's a twisting technique with your hands, but some of it, what do you want it to look like? And if you twist it this way, you can see where it's the beginning of what will be an apple with a little stem part kind of sticking out, right? And so then I know how much room I've got left and what size apple I want to make it. And then most people would blow up a balloon, kind of there. But if you want the apple to look more like a real apple, you actually start the air further down, right? So you start it like that. And then you can kind of control the shape of the apple with what you're doing with these, almost like a person's playing a flute, right? And what I'm doing is I'm making it tight against the other end, right? And then I keep it like this because now it's a long, right? It doesn't look quite, but now I'm gonna let the air out. Letting the air out actually does a few things, at least it did this time. The quality of the balloons, even though they were handmade, really didn't stand up well to lights in TV studios or on vaudeville or even stage shows. If you were outdoors, they could easily get punctured, right? But letting the air out gave you a lot of latitude for something that could break and you wouldn't have to worry about it. And now by twisting it with a knot a little differently than you did the top, what I've got isn't just this, but I've got this long part that can help make the inside of the apple. The reason this is kind of an interesting way to look at creating an apple isn't just, okay, this is the way it was done early on by my dad, and oh, here's the apple with the stem. But what my father realized was people, especially in the 1930s, who were fairly wealthy or were prominent business people, all had telephones. And so I've got a marker, but it would be a women's eyebrow pencil. And he would write in his phone number and hand it out as essentially his calling card to get work. He wasn't getting work at that time as a balloon twister. He was getting work as a magician who would make this his calling card, because to him, balloon twisting was something he did as a kid in a sanitarium. And he was a magician who used this as his calling card, and balloons was kind of just a side thing that he was having fun with. He certainly would do it as part of his magic shows, but it was balloon magic. There was no clowning with it. There was no just go twisting. It was balloon magic. And if you're an agent and somebody gives you this, it's kind of some balloon magic. And there's the guy's phone number. And because of the way I let the air out and the stem, this will last for a good 2.5 weeks. So he knew that it would sit on somebody's desk, and who wants to throw it out, right? So it became an easy way to have a calling card that looked a lot different from somebody else's.
So comparing this to modern twisters and what a lot of us are still doing today, there's something that you'd hand out that balloon, but and he would hand those out as calling cards. And I guess everything that I read in previous discussions we had, mostly what he was handing out was those apples, that it wasn't about making all sorts of incredible things. The only incredible things he did were on stage when the idea was to entertain an entire audience. And I guess, so I have to talk a little bit about my history for a second, and the way this all ties in and what I'm seeing is I remember in the 80s when I got into this, first of all, being told never use more than one balloon to give to a kid. That's too expensive to do more than that. Everything you make should be done with one balloon. And that was only possible because at one point the 260 came out. And everybody learned how to create incredible things with a single 260. That became the challenge. How many twists can you get into a balloon? How far can you take? Can you push that one thing? But of course, at that point, they were being made by machine. They were a lot more reliable, a lot more consistent. So it was possible to do that. But I think so much was forgotten about the earlier time when the most basic of animals. Today, we think of a dog that you make with 3 twists out of a 260. You couldn't do that. You needed 4, 5, 6 balloons just to make an interesting dog. And we wouldn't consider it interesting today. It was much later, I guess probably, in the 90s, we started talking about, well, why aren't we combining balloons and adding more to it and having more different shapes? And I remember a lot of people giving me a hard time because I was using dozens, hundreds, thousands of balloons in a single sculpture. So,
Right.
but that really is going back to what it was earlier. And a lot of the balloons
Exactly.
that were around then, a lot of those different shorter sizes have made their way back into the arsenal that balloon twisters are using now. And the second thing
Right.
that I see again, when I got into it in the 80s, there were some people that were using it for entertainment. I mean, like to entertain, to perform. To most people at that point were either doing it because they were experimenting with the material or because they were giving them out. It was so
Right.
weird for a lot of us later on to go, but why aren't we doing stage shows with these? Why? I mean, I personally remember a time getting off of a plane and my all of my balloons had been lost by the airline, and I was picked up at the airport and had to do a show with 7 balloons that were in my pocket. And I know, again, your dad had a similar story, much more dramatic because it ended up launching um,
Right.
another part of his career. Where
It
the
did.
balloon
Yeah.
wasn't just the apple that he was handing out; it turned into something much larger.
Yeah, and you could argue. I'll tell you what that point was. You could say that was sort of the beginning of modern twisting on the entertainment level, um, because you're right. The only thing he did for years with one balloon was the apple. It was the free giveaway. He was a magician. Here's a little bit of balloon magic. Here's my card. So vaudeville is happening still in the 30s. The Great Depression hits. Mass migration is happening everywhere via train for the CCC camps and people called hobos. Movies, the average person was seeing, dozens of movies per year. And so at that point, my dad is literally hopping trains and traveling as far west as Hollywood and then east into, Ohio and Pennsylvania and New York. And he's getting work in these CCC camps. He can't really travel a lot with a lot of magic, so he's doing smaller hand magic. And he's using the balloons as balloon magic. Eventually, he becomes good enough at the magic that he is in the Chicago area. He's starting to perform as an illusionist, bigger things on bigger stages, Chicago Theater, Medina Temple, and he goes to get a levitation magic illusion in Chicago. And when he comes back to his car, it's been broken into. All of his magic tricks have been stolen. He's got to go on stage that night to make money, and all he has are the balloons. And so instead of twisting balloons as a kid, as a plaything to show other people, as a side to being the sort of performer of magic who does some balloons, he literally went out that night. He did one magic trick what he just bought and said, now I'm going to show you something really different. Let's show you how to do magic just with balloons. And he took the balloons he had and twisted them into all the things that he had been doing in the sanitarium, as a kid traveling the country. And when the agents saw that, they'd never seen this sort of balloon magic act. They said, don't worry about the magic. Throw all those tricks away. Just focus on the balloons. Nobody's ever seen that. And that really sort of launches the modern day version of what we would think of as a twister performing. And the reason that one size was so key, one, it was the only kind that was available that wasn't a round one. And two, like I showed you with the apple, right? That same balloon, that could have been, in this case, it's a 50-incher, but at that time it was 3 feet long, right? So you could make it a couple inches or 3 feet. And being on stage, this is pre-television in the Depression years and even World War II, you've got to make something huge that people can see from 50 or 100 feet away or 5 feet away. Or in the case of a fairgrounds, it might be 200 feet away. And so the bigger he could make something and the more he would twist things into, the better off it was. Well, like anybody, he's used to giving his balloons away. What does he want to do at the end of a routine? He doesn't want to travel with all these balloons around. So he would bring assistants on stage. They would help hold the balloons, and then they would take him back to the audience. So if you think about it, for him, it became this easy way to travel the country, do balloon magic, and all of a sudden, all he had to have was a small suitcase or something he put in his coat, blow up a bunch of balloons, hand them out, and he was done for the day. And that really is where the end of the Depression years and the 40s sort of find us is in this balloon magic era where balloon twisting is now its own art, its own form of entertainment, not just tied into magic. We still haven't gotten to the clown part yet, but at that point, it becomes its own thing.
Right. So I was going to comment on the clown part, because now we've got in the 1920s he's the first, or one of the very first, twisting balloons at all. In the 30s he's the one of the first people handing out balloons anywhere. He's the first on stage doing a stage show with the balloons, and then the clown thing comes up. He may also be the very first balloon performer that put on a clown costume, because it sold. And
Right.
you know,
Well, and
that's
we've
interesting
got,
too,
and we've
because,
got,
well, he came to it through magic, is another one of those
right.
things that, you know, a lot of the people today that are doing it have also come to it through magic. And yet we still have, again, back to pop culture, which movie was it? Was a Wedding Crashers, um, make me a balloon clown, or
Right.
I don't remember
Right.
if I'm remembering the right movie, but you know, that you're a clown, you make balloons, you must be a clown, even though
Right.
the origin had nothing to do with clowning. It came through those
No,
magic
it didn't.
paths.
And so at the time, $50 was what he was getting paid to be a what we'd call a twister today, but balloon magic. And we've actually got a brochure I can show you of what he looked like as a balloon magician, where it isn't with a clown suit or anything. And as we put that up, just kind of look at the balloons that are around him and what that looks like, right? It's very theatrical. It's sort of, you know, vaudeville, but a little bit beyond vaudeville because we're moving into the TV era. And then as we go through the brochure, we'll go now to a clown one. And what happens is he is asked at some point, "Hey, is there any chance you could be a clown for this show?" And he realizes there's just not enough time to change in and out of the clown suit and do the balloons as well. And so he just says, "Well, look, that's fine. I'll just do the clown act, and then I'll come back and I'll do the balloon act in the clown suit." And and he gets them to agree, "Yeah, okay, we'll pay you $50 more for that." So instead of making 50, he makes 100. And initially he was so excited because it was double his money. Agents continually promised they would pay him double, but you know what? Like anything, it was just do the part that's you with the clown suit and the balloons, right? So the agents weren't stupid. They wanted to make as much profit as they could. And so at that point, they stopped wanting the balloon magician. They wanted now the clown who does balloons, because that was a new novelty. And so that is something totally fallen into by accident, him filling in that day as a clown and not being able to take off the makeup in time. And so that's kind of where that era, late 40s, early 50s, is born. And now it just explodes, because at that point, TV is becoming very popular. And so whereas before you could hop on a railroad train somewhere, now you could get on as the interstate's being built, not just Route 66, but legs of highways were being built. And in one day, you could actually do something in the morning for one TV show, in the afternoon for another. And so there's a great story in the 50s where he's somewhere in Ohio, and he goes on a morning show and says, "Tomorrow the circus or the fair opens, and anybody who says Hank the Clown sent me will get in for free as a kid." Well, they were going to let kids in for free anyways for the first day, right? And he does something with balloons and doesn't think anything of it. It's the early days of TV. And the next day, lined up for more than a block, are all these kids and parents waiting to get into the fair. And people are asking, "What's going on?" "Oh, Hank the Clown sent me. Hank the Clown sent me." And it was really just sort of by accident that people started to realize the power of television, and putting somebody on TV who's twisting balloons in a clown suit just became the only way to put something on TV. And that doesn't mean that you didn't have other performers at that time, a Wally Bogue or a Bonnert or a John Shirley, but they were all coming at it from something different, as either a Hollywood entertainer, a puppeteer, something unique, and not this kid who was a twister almost by self-creation, who becomes a magician, who then out of, misfortune turns himself into a balloon twister act. And then because of something that happens with a clown on a show, becomes the clown who's twisting balloons on TV, right? It all converges in that sort of weird era. And you end up with, him doing essentially the same routine, but now he's got a clown suit on, and he's twisting many of the same things. This is now what the act is. It's still going to hospitals. You're still doing things because kids have polio. But now the entertainment industry is going national with national shows like Ed Sullivan, or we'll show you a clip in just a second of him on Bozo Circus in Chicago on WGN. WGN, as many may know, in Chicago was called the Superstation. And in the late 60s and 70s, you had the major networks, but then you had one particular channel out of Chicago. This is me actually with my dad in the mid-70s, and they're broadcasting not just to Chicago, but all throughout the country because there's this new technology called satellite. And so it's noon Central Time, Monday through Friday for an hour, and there is a 10-minute window every day for a circus act to perform. The first time he performed in a clown suit. That kind of went against the fact that it was Bozo the Clown and Bozo Circus, so they asked him to not perform as a clown anymore. And so for about a decade, he would go on TV. I remember thinking, even at this time, this is great. My friends, I'm in school. They'll get to see this. And then later that year, taking a drive down to Florida, and people in Florida saying, "Oh yeah, I remember seeing you on TV," because we didn't really realize the sort of superstation reach of WGN in the 1970s with satellite. And so you've got this essentially national kids show. He's going on once a year, performing. And this is also where John Shirley really takes off, because John was the other balloon twister in the Chicago area. And so a lot of what you see here is really kind of both exciting to show you, because it's some of the very rare footage from the 70s of what was at that point a live show. It's also sort of sad because I would say it's the end of the original twister era. Modern balloon twisting, different sizes, the 2-inch balloon, all of that is starting to appear on scene. And frankly, who's watching these kinds of kids shows by the 80s? Not many, right? Saturday morning cartoons are going away. This show's popularity starts to die down, and you really end up with people who can travel to see entertainment. It's a much different way of doing things. So I'm excited to show this to you, but at the same time, it's a little bit sad because you start to realize that this is kind of the end of a twister era that nobody really knew was about to end. But excitedly, it's here for people to watch and feel entertained and hopefully experience, if not for the first time, in many ways, see what it looked like at the transition of about roughly 50 years ago. What you just saw him do there, by the way, I'd like to just mention, blowing the balloon backward. That was one of the ways to get that 3-inch balloon to look more like a 2-inch wide balloon and to create a swan. And that's one of the few things that I'd like to, maybe at a different time when we have more time, talk about what you can do with a balloon when you've only got one size and you want to twist it into something different. Stretching it from your foot up, blowing it up backward, actually will change the shape of the balloon. The other thing I'd love to share a little bit about that was happening into the 70s, but really died out when Dad stopped working in the 80s, is shooting the balloon. And you can see he shot it all the way across the studio. He would know how to shoot it so that it could either travel across the audience and then away from them, stick to a wall, and I remember this because we did this in Dayton, Ohio at the Shrine Circus in the mid-70s. I remember he and I had a contest, could we shoot it inside of a woman's purse who was up in the audience? And so we would do things like that. This was a boomerang where it would come back down. The negative with this is that it got stuck up in the lights. But I want to show you this because ultimately he moved twisting away from just the normal, hey, let's twist it into an animal, to let's make it look by like 3 or 4 different animals, like the swan that really was a rocket ship and an airplane and all that. Then he says, hey, let's start doing these things where we toss out the balloon at the end, called the balloon barrage, you may have heard of. And then finally, and nobody to this day really does this anymore, I can do it because he taught me, but it was really target practice, shooting the balloon. And this is one of many examples of what we would do if we needed to stretch. All right, we do it twice from a further distance or a smaller target. That kind of entertainment, I think, died out in part because it really took years and years and years. I mean, probably practiced that for 10 years before I could really get it down, not just to shoot it through a simple target, but to be able to go long distances and do silly things, and then end with, the kids holding up their hands and waving goodbye to him, right? That was kind of an easy way to get out. But if you watch as he walks off, right, what props does he have left? Nothing. All he's got left is what's holding up where the balloons used to be. The balloons are now out in the audience. He can move on to another show, and in many cases dressed up as a clown. So those are fun techniques that would be great to talk about at some point.
So on that note, let's wrap up for this evening. We'll share this with all of you, and I look forward to doing part 2 as soon as we have a chance to get together.